Welcome back. I am Danny, and this is Silent Motive, where we explore the strange, the unsettling, and the chilling mysteries that just don't quit. On today's episode, we are going to talk about the old Satanic Panic. But before we get too deep into it, don't forget to give us a like, a follow, a share, a subscribe, or hell, even a rating wherever you are getting your weekly dose of Silent Motive. Now go ahead and make yourself a delicious drink and settle in because this is a wild ride, and guess what? You do not want to get caught with your pants down. So, Satanic Panic, sometimes known as ritual abuse, cult abuse, or SRA. Over 12,000 cases that started in North America in the 1980s that is still present today. With the movies like Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, and The Omen coming out in the late 60s and early 70s, this sent people into a full-blown moral panic. With crime rates on the rise and concerns about the devil's influence, people didn't know what to believe. But this wasn't just about spooky movies anymore. In 1980, one book would pour gasoline on that fire. A book that claimed to uncover hidden memories of satanic ritual abuse. That book was Michelle Remembers. The book made claims about satanic ritual abuse, or SRA, involving Michelle. This led to thousands of allegations of physical and sexual abuse that led to full-blown criminal investigations that actually ended with court cases with nothing to back them. How did fear of the occult spiral into one of the largest moral panics in our history? Let's see how wild shit really got. Alright, so like I mentioned, it's 1980, and psychiatrist Lawrence Pazder has a patient, 27-year-old Michelle Smith. She actually becomes his wife, by the way. Yikes. Lawrence spends over 600 hours with Michelle. Some of that time with Michelle actually being under hypnosis. Now, Lawrence's goal is to help Michelle. She came to him with trauma, and he was working to uncover what the cause was. Michelle eventually gets to the point of clarity and remembers a time when she was 5 years old. Michelle says how she remembers being offered up to Satan himself as a sacrifice for a cult of devil worshippers called
the Feast of the Beast.
In this 3-month-long ritual, Michelle claims that she witnessed weird chanting, saw animals being sacrificed, she was tortured, imprisoned, and she was used to bring Satan back up from the depths of hell through a portal back to earth. And I guess it was by the grace of Satan, I guess, he was raised. So old Satan comes walking through that portal, but was actually sent back by the good old Virgin Mary and Michael, the archangel. Anyway, Lawrence decides he is going to write this memoir about Michelle and the things that she remembered from when she was 5 years old. Lawrence documented that Michelle spoke to him about the satanic ritual abuse in detail, a term that he actually came up with after spending all this time with her. This book actually tapped into the fears of this hidden evil of the devil, hell, and Satanism. Even law enforcement hopped on board and was using this as a sort of guideline for training on this topic. Now, the problem that came up when this book came out, documenting all of these terrible things, was, were there bruises? Were there marks? Were there evidence of months of torture and abuse? Michelle claimed that St. Mary actually got rid of them. What about Michelle's family? Didn't they notice that this was going on? Where were they? Did they get interviewed for this memoir? The answer is no. Lawrence said, I don't think I want to hear what they have to say. Eventually, Michelle's own family did deny her claims, and the damage was already done. The book gave people a framework, and suddenly reports of satanic ritual abuse began flooding in, overwhelming law enforcement and child protective services. Regardless of the family speaking out and saying that this wasn't happening, By September of 1990, Lawrence had already been acting as an expert for law enforcement in over 1,000 different cases. Hell, pun intended. He was even teaching classes and training law enforcement on what to look for in these cases when they came up. And with more eyes on child abuse than ever, thanks to the new reporting laws, investigators began seeing Satan in every single shadow. Now, for those who might not know what that means, basically, a mandatory reporter is required by law to report these crimes against children. These laws didn't go into effect until the early 1980s, so after this book came out probably. Now, with these laws, there was a huge increase for Child Protective Service investigators. The whole world was on the lookout for potential child abuse, along with investigating incest. But
why wasn't that already being looked at?
The problem here was that CPS investigators were doing the investigations on their own and interviewing these children with very leading questions and approaches. Another issue was the change in how these cases were being prosecuted, which led to dads out there providing confessions in exchange for plea bargains. This then spiraled from incestual cases to children alleging abuse from caregivers, from organized rituals and satanic rituals with satanic symbols. Then came in the case that defined the hysteria, the McMartin Preschool trial. This case actually began in 1983 and wasn't done until 1990. That sounds awful and expensive. It was actually one of the most expensive criminal trials in American history. How expensive, you might ask? $15 million expensive over the course of 7 years without a conviction. So, 1983, mom, Judy Johnson, made a report to police that her son had been sexually abused by her husband, as well as a teacher, Ray Buckey, at the preschool. While there is no right or wrong way to disclose abuse, this one was definitely unique. Judy said that because her son was having a painful bowel movement, this meant he was being abused. As a mom, I can't say that that would be my first thought, but what do I know? Due to the age of Judy's son, it was never confirmed that he was abused. Her son also never picked Ray from a series of pictures. I did read that he was only 2.5 years old when this initially began. That in and of itself is way too young to put any kind of weight into him picking a photo or confirming or denying it happening. But Ray was arrested, and he actually spent 5 years in jail. Ray wasn't the only one who was named in this investigation. His sister Peggy, his mom, and a handful of other daycare workers were charged as well. After the initial disclosure from Judy, 48 more children alleged abuse was happening. The kids were questioned and had psych evals done, which, what the fuck does that even mean? Why are we doing psych evals on children? But they didn't just say there was abuse. Yep.
You guessed it.
They said satanic rituals were also happening in these underground tunnels. Children disclosed that these rituals would consist of sacrificing animals in these tunnels. The children said they saw witches flying around and children being flushed down the toilet. Even Judy said that Ray could fly. It wasn't until 3 years into this investigation that the defense was informed that Judy had suffered from mental illness that was likely worsening by the trial. Oh, and guess who also met with the families? Lawrence, the psychiatrist, and Michelle, the book writers. The weird part here is there was evidence of old buildings being found on the site, but not quite tunnels or secret chambers. But investigators were never able to prove this is where Ray actually took the children and actually abused them. This case ended up with 3 juries that couldn't come to an agreement on guilty or not, simply because the disclosures these children made were just so bizarre and inconsistent. Eventually, children started coming forward and saying that their stories about the abuse were make-believe. The stories the kids told were found out to be largely influenced by the psychologists conducting the interviews with them. Now, After this whole thing was said and done, Ray was pretty cooked. You can't go through a 7-year-long child abuse trial that makes national news and expect to go back into the daycare field. That's just not going to happen. In today's investigations, the way that children are interviewed is very open-ended, and it helps prevent this type of thing from happening with the leading questions. While the McMartin case was dominating headlines, panic spread into unexpected corners of culture. Even a role-playing game found itself accused of opening the gates of hell. What game, you might ask? Oh, you may have heard of him. Just a little D&D or Dungeons and Dragons. Now, in 1983, a lady named Patricia Poling joined forces with the director of the National Coalition on TV Violence, so television violence, and they created this group called BAD with 2 Ds. What does BAD stand for? You might be asking yourself. I'm going to tell you. Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons. I would join that group. BAD's stance was that this was satanic specific and was introducing the youth to unaliving, murder, and satanic ritual abuse. Patricia founded this group after her son, Irving, did remove himself from life by shooting himself in the chest in 1982. Irving did play role-playing games, and Patricia believed his suicide was directly related to D&D. Now, the good news here was that studies were actually conducted, and apparently during this time frame when this was all happening, the youth who were involved in role-playing games actually had a lower rate of suicide than average. Patricia went on to co-author a book titled The Devil's Web, Who is Stalking Your Children for Satan, in 1989. That's when I was born. I'm sure she was just a grieving mother who didn't want other mothers to experience what she had. I really can't imagine the loss that she felt, so I don't fault her for trying or doing any of this. But honestly, I don't think that the game was to blame. And it wasn't just games. Other factors during this time, like heavy metal music, educators, so our teachers are out there spreading the word of Satan. Of course, child care centers and the good old television. This was all right around the time when Ozzy Osbourne, rest in paradise, bit a head off a bat during a show in 1982. What better way to show the world you worship Satan than to perform an animal sacrifice in front of thousands of people? I'm joking. That's not what that was. Little did the world know, he believed that it was a rubber bat like fans used to throw on stage all the time. So he had no idea it was a real bat. That's what I've heard. We'll let that be the story. Part of the culture of rock and roll or heavy metal is to definitely go against the norm. In my opinion, the artists at the time figured might as well lean into it. When parents tell their kids that they can't have something, it makes them want it more. It makes them more curious about that specific thing. So, naturally, good Christian parents believed rock and roll is the work of Satan, the devil himself. They aren't going to allow their children to listen to it, which then causes the kids to be more curious about it. It causes them to want to learn about it and be a part of it more. It doesn't mean that they were Satanists. But the fear didn't stop at games or music. It added to the growing belief that Satanists were everywhere. People really believed that Satanists were infiltrating the media and police departments. They thought they were running morgues and disposing of bodies to cover up hidden agendas of Satanism. There was even talk about how there was no missing person reports for these sacrifices because the Satanists were using select women for breeding, which provided the Satanists with thousands of babies for sacrifice. No place felt safe. Unfortunately, this widespread panic brought people together. There were psychologists, therapists, law enforcement, self-help groups, religious fundamentalists, just to name a handful. Not that people coming together is a bad thing per se, but people feed off of each other. So this blew up, causing religious fundamentalists promoting rumors of satanic ritual abuse. There were psychotherapists who were diagnosing patients as dissociative identity disorder, with some of them believing that these were the results of demonic possession. Another case that was very similar to the McMartin case was one that actually took place here in Lehi, Utah. In the summer of 1985, Sheila Bowers took her children to a therapist, Barbara Snow. The kids told Barbara they had been sexually abused by their babysitter, who happened to be the bishop of the LDS Church's daughter. Word got out about the children disclosing, so other parents took their children to Barbara for therapy. The children ended up disclosing upwards of 40 or more adults being involved with this satanic ritual abuse of them. The Utah County Sheriff's Office, as well as the Utah Attorney General's Office, began what became a 2.5-year investigation. The bishop's children were actually taken away by Child Protective Services, but they did get returned a few weeks later for lack of evidence of abuse. Ultimately, the investigation only yielded charges on Alan Hadfield. It came out later during the trial that a chief deputy attorney testified that he saw Barbara coaching the children through a two-way mirror. Barbara had conditioned the kids to the point the attorney was concerned about using them as witnesses. Barbara made excuses for her behavior and said she wasn't a law enforcement investigator and needed to create an environment that the children would feel comfortable disclosing the abuse in. One of Barbara's colleagues stated that she was concerned with the children's disclosures. A 10-year-old testified that Barbara asked her 50 times in one session if Hadfield had touched her, and she finally said that he did because she was afraid that Barbara would yell at her. Sounds like Barbara's...
maybe the fucking devil herself.
She's yelling at little kids, and she's a therapist. Cases like this one showed how entire communities could unravel over suspicion. If this wasn't wild enough, psychologists soon added fuel to the fire. One bizarre example came in 1990. We had old psychologist D. Cordon Hammond, who basically said he knew what was going on. He knew what was up. So old D here would perform hypnotherapy on his patients, who said they were victims of torture and ritual abuse that was used to create alternate personalities that could be activated by a code word. These patients were allegedly trained as assassins, sex workers, drug traffickers, and children's sex workers. These patients revealed this information to him and told him the mastermind was actually a Jewish doctor from Nazi Germany, but now worked for the CIA, and his goal was worldwide domination by satanic cult. And yes, people believed this. These patients had lapses in memory, which proved that somehow this doctor man had control over them and was clearly furthering his agenda. And naturally, everyone believed D because he was a prominent psychologist in the field at this time. I mentioned it earlier, but the media did play a huge role in Satanic Panic. Geraldo Rivera ran a 2-hour special called Devil Worship, Exposing Satan's Underground. Geraldo was known across the world and was in roughly 20 million homes, which of course would cause mass hysteria. Geraldo opens up the episode by saying he is going to speak with Satan believers as well as naysayers, law enforcement, and men of God. He prefaces the episode by warning the youth and the impressionable that this is not something they should be watching. But then he turns around and he says he wants teenagers and their parents to pay close attention because they are the ones out there that will fall into this dark horror story. He goes on to say that while not everyone who enjoys heavy metal are Satanists, there are a few, which is a true statement, even today. He interviews people who were former Satanists who said they would drink blood, which of course naturally correlates with heavy metal. Geraldo speaks about a handful of murders and crimes that were committed during this time period and how the people committing them all go back to it being a ritual and in the name of Satan. Kind of sounds like a scapegoat to me. But now even Oprah got on board and she talked about the occult. In 1989, Oprah had a guest on her show under a fake name who claimed they were a survivor of the secret Jewish satanic cult that was involved with the baby sacrifices. This caused the Anti-Defamation League to get involved and said it was an instance of a blood libel, which I had to look up, and that's an accusation that Jewish people use the blood of Christians in religious rituals. And it was anti-Semitic prejudice. This was a perfect example of how the media could influence a nation. The guests ended up speaking out later about the fallout, which in turn just ended up muddying the waters even further. When daytime talk shows and primetime specials treating these stories as real, public fear wasn't just entertained, it was validated. Eventually, the panic did begin to subside, and that was around the mid-1990s. HBO released a movie about the McMartin case, but had Ray as a victim of someone who was being prosecuted under false claims. In 1995, Geraldo said,
Gosh, you know what? My bad for what I said in 1987.
the late 1980s to the late 1990s was quite a wild ride for the world, especially after the 60s and the 70s, which was a time of love and peace, man. To be followed by some of the worst and well-known serial killers in U.S. history, it was basically just one thing after the next. Each decade was trying to outdo the last. Luckily, we made it through and out the other side. It's crazy to think how paranoia can blur the lines between reality and fear. That's it for today's episode. Again, thank you for joining me on this dark ride through Satanic Panic, where fear blurred the lines between fact and fiction, and the consequences were definitely real. Make sure you give us a rate, give us a follow, a like, a subscribe, wherever you're listening to us, and we'll catch you on the next one.